Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final event in the Davis Museum's virtual artist talk series, Handmade Photography Today. My name is Sasha Bretzker, and I am a member of Wellesley's class of 2023. I major in political science and French, and I am a student visitor assistant at the Davis. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome the artist Pushpamala N, who creates vivid tableaux and photo performances that satirize the history of studio photography in India. We begin with a native land acknowledgement. Wellesley College occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary unceded lands of the Massachusetts tribe. We recognize that we are on stolen land, and we extend our gratitude to the many Indigenous peoples who have rich histories here, including the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc nations, for their ongoing stewardship of the land. We commit to recognizing, supporting, and advocating for the sovereignty of the Indigenous nations whose traditional territories are in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, as well as for the many Indigenous peoples who live, work, and study in Wellesley and Massachusetts. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and commit to holding Wellesley College more accountable to the needs of Indigenous peoples. This land acknowledgement was created by the Wellesley Native American Student Association, and we thank them for their labor. To participate in today's program, please note that this event is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming days. We are using a webinar format, and your microphone and video have been turned off during the presentation. Throughout the event, you can use the Q&A box to enter your questions and to upvote other questions. We will leave 20 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. The Davis Museum is grateful to the Burns Schwartz Family Foundation for sponsoring the Handmade Photography Today Artist Talk series. We'd also like to acknowledge our co-hosts, the Photographic Resource Center, located at Wellesley University. The PRC host exhibitions, presentations, and gatherings that support the creation and understanding of light-based media with the goal of inspiring its members, educational institutions, and the photography community with new work, ideas, and methods. For more information, visit prcboston.org. Now, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Carrie Cushman, the Linda Wyatt Gruber Class of 1966 Curatorial Fellow in Photography at the Davis Museum, who will introduce tonight's speakers.
Thank you so much, Sasha, and thanks as well to our student guide, Lexi Fitzgerald, for providing assistance behind the scenes with today's webinar. And thanks as well to Arthurina Fears, Curator of Education and Programs at the Davis, for her tireless work coordinating the Handmade Photography Today Artist Talk series. This series was originally conceived in connection to an exhibition on 19th century portrait photography, which was on view at the Davis Museum in early 2020. And I encourage everyone to explore the online version of Making Not Taking Portrait Photography in the 19th Century, which is available on the Davis Museum's Google Arts and Culture website. I imagined the Handmade Photography Today series as a contemporary correlate to the historical material on view in this exhibition, a way for us to unpack the power dynamics inherent in the space of the 19th century portrait studio, alongside artists who are using alternative processes and handmade methods to think through important issues related to identity and memory. For that reason, I cannot think of a better artist to conclude the series than Pushpamala N, who restages moments from the history of the portrait studio in India in her creative photo performances. In conversation with Pushpamala this afternoon is Dr. Liza Oliver, Associate Professor of Art History at Wellesley College, where she also has an affiliate position in South Asia Studies. She researches and teaches on European imperial and colonial histories, particularly in South Asia. Her first book, Art, Trade, and Imperialism in Early Modern French India, published in 2019, explored the intersections of aesthetics, science, and often violent commercialism that marked the French East India Company's engagement with India's textiles industries along the Coromandel coast in the 17th and 18th centuries. Her current book project, Empire of Hunger, representing famine, land, and labor in colonial India, considers photographs by British civil servants, engineers, and tourists, which collectively constitute a visual record of economic liberalism, colonial humanitarianism, and their fraught convergence around famines that devastated South Asia in the second half of the 19th century. Thank you for being with us today, Liza. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Pushpamala N, who has been called the most entertaining artist iconoclast of contemporary Indian art. Starting off her career as a sculptor, Pushpamala began using photography and video in the mid 1990s, creating tableaux and photo performances in which she casts herself in various roles. Interested in history and the idea of cultural memory, she simultaneously inhabits and questions familiar frames from art history, photography, film, theater, and popular culture, playfully placing herself as the artist at the center of social and political inquiry. Her pioneering work in conceptual photography, video, performance, and sculpture are strongly feminist and have deeply influenced art practice in India. Pushpamala has exhibited in major biennales and festivals, and her work has been featured in exhibitions at the Tate Modern and Saatchi Art Gallery, the Centre Pompidou, the Seattle Art Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Royal Ontario Museum, among others. Her work is in the collections of important museums such as Centre Pompidou in Paris, MoMA in New York, the Tate Modern in London, the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney, the National Gallery of Modern Art in Delhi, the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art in Delhi, and the Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore. Pushpamala is the winner of several honors, including most recently the Jaganachari Award in 2016 and the recipient of the IFA Arts Grant also in 2016. She was the curator and artistic director of the Chennai Photo Biennale in 2019. She writes and speaks at conferences and gives lectures worldwide. She works as an independent artist in Bangalore, India. Welcome, Pushpamala. We're so happy to have you here with us today. You can go ahead and share your screen and turn on your video. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Carrie, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a prehistory before I start showing my work and talking about that, because I'm actually trained as a sculptor. And I studied in this in art school in Baroda in Western India. And that was in the late 70s and early 80s. And at that time, actually, art historians in India were not really interested in, you know, 18th and 19th centuries, the period under British colonization, because they felt the art was very hybrid and degenerate. But some of my teachers and artists in India were very interested in that period. And they were also collecting photographs from the 19th century. So it's very interesting, the history of photography in India, because photography came in almost immediately after it was invented in Europe. And the early photographs, I was really interested in early photography in my student days. What had happened was that the local courts were sort of disintegrating. And so these miniature painters started using photographs as drawings and or started doing photography. So they would probably take a studio photograph and use the figure as a drawing and paint the costumes on, and sometimes completely change the background, where instead of a plain wall and a curtain or something like that, there would be a magnificent palace at the back. So that was very fascinating, where of course, and then again, there were pilgrimage centers like Nathadwara in Western India, where they had they would take photographs of pilgrims and cut them out and stick them onto the paintings of the icon Krishna over there. So there are all these fascinating histories, which are sort of alternative histories of photography in a way, and not really taken seriously because they were seen as really hybrid. But that's what interested me. But I actually started doing photography by chance in the mid 90s. And I was living in Mumbai at the time, and I was asked to give a work for to a gallery for a group show. I think it was some sort of anniversary of cinema, 75 years or something like that. I'm not sure. But so I thought for fun that I would dress up like this 1930s stunt film heroine star called Fearless Nadia, who was actually this Australian woman who had somehow come to India and had become very popular as a stunt actress in Hindi films. So she wore many costumes, but I got this costume made, which was a kind of Zorro-like masked costume, and we took some. I asked a friend of mine to take photographs. And one thing I must say is that I'm not a photographer myself. At least I don't photograph my work. And I work with photographers. Some of them are friends. Some of them are photo studios. And some of them are professional photographers. So, what I did was, this is my first work, and it's just showing a few images of each and quickly going on. But this is my first work called Phantom Lady or Kismet, where I'm dressed as, I'm this kind of mysterious figure called Phantom Lady, who's dressed in the Zorro-like costume, and I come to the city of Mumbai. It's shot on location all over Mumbai, and I come to rescue my lost twin sister, who's a kind of the gangster's mall. Anyway, so I call it a photo romance, and this is again a very interesting form which was invented in Italy in the 1930s apparently for working class women to read, and it was usually, I think it used to have text, but I've not used text in mine, and it spread very quickly all over the world. So you found it very commonly in magazines, like even in India, so in different languages, in popular magazines, there'd be these little domestic or love stories with these photographs of characters enacting scenes with text. So this again is another alternate form of photography that I'm interested in. And this is another photo romance called Sunere Sapne or Golden Dreams. And here these photographs are painted. And there again, there's this housewife in a nightdress who's fantasizing about this nightclub dancer, who is this woman in a golden frock and a buffet. And mysterious things are happening here. And so when I started working like this, when I had my first show in Mumbai, for instance, in a Phantom Lady, it caused quite a kind of furor and a sensation, because I think even till quite recently, the photography scene has been quite conventional. And basically it was Magnum kind of style documentary photography, or maybe art photography, which was, both of them are very purist, so they don't like they always use only ambient light, believe in using ambient light, black and white, and so a certain kind of style. So really fiddling around with all that was quite sort of, shocking. And another thing that I'm interested in is I found was the Victorian tableau form. So what happened after I shot Phantom Lady was that I moved from Mumbai to my hometown, which is Bangalore, because I built a studio over here. And I was wondering how to sort of get into Bangalore and how to work in Bangalore, because it's quite a different city from Bombay or Mumbai. And then I thought of sort of referring to something from the past of my family. My mother used to be an amateur actress, and she used to organize these pageants and tableaux. And I think that whole thing came from the Victorian tableau. This is me when I was around 8 years old. And this is a scene from the Ramayana, the Indian epic. And I'm kneeling down over there, and I'm being liberated from being a stone. And those stones are very funny because they're actually cut sort of foundation stones. And I can't remember who the other kids were, but this was, these kind of events used to go on for sometimes for festivals and for annual days and things like that. So this is my mother, who used to love dressing up, and she's this nationalist figure who's the Queen of Jhansi, who led a battle against the British during the mid-19th century First War of Independence, as it's called. So what's very interesting, when I was reading about the history of these tableaux, the tableau form, which was very popular in Victorian England, was that they also did these nationalistic tableaux. But when I really started using the tableau and studio photography, the traditional studio photography, which I'm very interested in, with the painted sets and all that, was in this long project that I did in collaboration with Claire Arney, who's actually British and who's lived most of her life in South India. And the first, I think the initial idea when I wrote a proposal to get funding for it was that we would recreate several existing images of South Indian women. So that South Indian women immediately brought up a kind of ethnographic element in this, though I wasn't thinking of it then, and it started coming more and more into the work later on. But as we started working, I think it started expanding, and finally it became a huge sort of series or a project which had 4 different series in that. And what I'm showing you right now is the principal series, which is called the Native Types. And here there are these different kinds of images which have been recreated from the one on the left is from a film publicity still. The one on the right is from a painting by a very popular painter called, an influential painter called Ravi Verma. And this Orientalist scene of this woman with pot. And that's the goddess Lakshmi, again by a famous Ravi Verma calendar, which everybody has in their puja rooms. And on the right is a film still, which my background painter gave it to me. He'd done the art direction for this film, I believe. So yeah, on the left is the the Toda figure, which became very. I'll talk about it in more detail later on. And this on the one on the right is based on a newspaper photograph. So I'm really looking at different histories of photography and of image making, and using them as references or base images. The one on the left is a well-known painting by Ravi Verma again, and the one on the right is a miniature painting, 16th century miniature painting. So the very, very elaborate sort of tableaus in which the backdrops, the painted backdrops, there are props, these are the thermocol sort of rocks on which I'm sitting. And so it used to take, the production used to take something like 3 or 4 months to do, And a lot of them were like sort of, for example, I think the most elaborate one was the Toda figure on the left. I think I had to make the grid, get it made 3 times. It was silk screened, and each time it was just slightly off. Each, of course, I'll be talking about it more in detail later. But for example, the stand, I think it was done over 3 times, because the first time I gave it to a carpenter, like he carved it like a temple pillar. He didn't understand the drawing at all, even though I'd given sort of scale drawings. And so on. I embroidered the shawl, which I'm wearing. So they're very elaborate. And we had a professional makeup man to do the makeup. So they were very, very elaborate tableaus, which also took a lot of research. So I'll talk a little bit in detail about this. So on the left is this, the original photograph, which is by Maurice Vidal Portman, a British anthropologist who did these famous studies in the Andamans, which are these islands of India, in which actually what are called very primitive tribes still live. So when I first saw this photograph, I think in a book by Vidya Daheja, I was really shocked, because it was just, I felt it was very cruel. At the same time, it was very striking because of this checked background. And I started sort of doing some research on it. And I discovered that this background was actually, each square is 2 inches by 2 inches. And these people used to take these backdrops around. And so that in the photograph, so when the person is placed in front of the backdrop, you can easily measure the dimensions. And this particular stand, which was so difficult to copy, was actually, it's got a system like something like a beach umbrella, which can be, The top part is a metal bit which can be lowered or heightened. And it's so that the stretched arm could rest on it, because photographs in the late 19th century used to take a long time, perhaps like half an hour to set up, in which the models had to be absolutely still. Then on the right is my recreation, which is not an exact recreation because I did not want to be naked. But this is another very old tribal community in the south of India called the Todas. And in fact, there were many studies of them as well, but not quite by Portman, not against the checkered background. Yeah, another thing I'd like to say is some years before I started this project in 2000, I'd been to Australia, and in Sydney, I had seen this very large show of Aboriginal photographs, 19th century photographs. And I was very interested in seeing, in fact, I bought the catalog, and which I used as a reference for a lot of works in this series, which are based on ethnographic photography. So this, I'm going to sort of dismantle this in some detail, because what happened was that each of the series actually deconstructed the original image by referring to other kind of photographic traditions. For example, all the characters were also shot against this checkered backdrop. So all of them, whether they were mythological figures or fictitious figures, or figures from different classes and types, became ethnographic objects. And then there was this whole series, which I call the ethnographic series, in which became more and more playful. And there were different kinds of scenes, which sort of also using contemporary props and objects, which became part of this. And some of them are actually, there are references to British postcards and different kinds of ethnographic. For example, on the left, there's this reference to this very famous painting by Indian modern artist called Amrita Shergill, Woman on Charpoy. And on the right is also a reference to one of the photographers had, there was a photograph like this where actually a tribal woman, I think, was holding a camera. So it's this whole thing of the camera and the subject and the object and myself performing. So here this woman is playing cricket. She's a construction worker on the right and so on, sitting on a cycle. This is another series called the Popular series, in which all these characters, the original characters from the native types, start sort of having fun in a popular street side studio. So there is the woman, the woman with the pot who's holding a phone in her hand, and it's just like these popular studios which you find off the street. So then there was this other series, this is the fourth series called the Process series, and that actually showed the makeup and the photography, the shoot, actually how it happened. And this is my studio in which I used to set up these, we set up these tableaux. So I'm going to also show you the how I installed the work in the solo shows. So the native types was put up like this. It was in the same size as oleographs in India, popular oleographs, and they were hung slightly much above eye level and slanting forwards, like you find pictures and photographs in Indian homes. In the exhibitions, I use the painted backdrops and the costumes. In fact, this is the final one, which was in New York, but in the first one in Bangalore, it was just crowded with objects. It's a cycle, the sewing machine, everything that I used. The ethnographic photographs for, sorry, it's going, okay. Were shown like this in museum cases with objects. And they're the same size as the original 19th century ethnographic photographs. So while I was doing the Native Women project, which was between 2000 and 2004, it was very long drawn. I also did the series of works in a photography studio in Bombay, Mumbai, called the India Photo Studio, which was owned by Mr. J.H. Thakkar. I was in Mumbai actually for an artist's residency, and somebody told me about the studio, so I went to investigate. This is Mr. J.H. Thakkar with all his equipment. And he has a very interesting history because after partition, he came from Pakistan and in fact, apparently first moved to Bangalore, but then moved to Bombay because obviously Bombay was better for business. And he set up his studio very close to the film studios in Bombay. So in the 50s and 60s, he actually took many famous portraits of the most popular film stars of the day, which are like seen as classics and still being used today. And he used what is called the Hollywood glamour style, which is actually based on expressionist photography. So there's a lot of chiaroscuro and deep shadows and a lot of black. But he also created sort of narratives in his studio. And I did a series of works with him called the Navarasa Suite. And Navarasa it's a Sanskrit word meaning 9 moods, which were used in Sanskrit, in Indian aesthetics and in art and in dance and theater and so on. It's still being used in traditional theater. There are whole theories about it. And so I created these kind of images. One is, I think on the left, it's love, Shringara, and then fury. So again, I had to pose for several hours while he lit up. It takes 3 or 4 hours to light up and extremely uncomfortable. And I did not know how the photographs would look because obviously I couldn't see them when see myself being photographed. And sometimes one had to reshoot. But he used these kind of shadows, which I sort of took from, and sometimes we just cut out shapes. And I think this one on the right, he had a kind of, it's a lovely studio actually. It's an Art Deco studio, with really beautiful. And he has all these objects which he also uses for his shoots. Like this, I think this shadow on the right is created by the back of a chair. But what is interesting is Mr. Thakkar had stopped doing this kind of work in the 60s. And what he did presently was actually corporate portraits and also portraits of for weddings, matchmaking sort of portraits. So once when I was sitting there, in fact, this young girl came in with followed by 2 older women who were obviously her mother and aunt or something, with several trunks. And then they had I watched the shoot. She would dress up in traditional and modern and Western and Indian clothes. For example, the first shoot might be in a sari, and the second shoot would be in a dress. The third shoot would be in jeans, and so on. So it's very amusing actually what goes on. So this is the kind of work he was doing then. His whole studio was filled with these wonderful old photographs of his. So then what happened was, this is interesting, in 2009, I was invited by the Centre Pompidou to, I was commissioned actually to work in this studio in France called Studio Arcou, which had a similar history to the India Photo Studio, because the curators had seen this work and they wanted me to do something collaboratively with the Studio Arcou. And this was for the show in 2011 called Paris, Delhi, Bombay. So I did 3 works over there, and in fact it was quite similar to the work I do in India, in the sense that I take images from or cultural material from Indian culture, or images from Indian culture and history, and reconstruct them to, in a sense, deconstruct them. And so I chose 3 images from French history, and the first one was Delacroix's Liberty. I'm not showing it to you now because everybody's familiar with the work, but and the second one, which obviously talked about you know, liberty, equality, fraternity, and France was as the center of democracy. And all 3 images I chose were from the 19th century. So liberty was the first image, and the second image was, I found this Ingres engraving after an Ingres work called The Slave and Her Slave, a very Orientalist sort of image. And this was also the time of empire, you know, of colonization, high period of colonization. And so this was very interesting that there was a talk of liberty and there's also the talk of enslavement. So that's myself playing the slave. And then this is a very interesting image that I found. In fact, one of my, I think a curator I met suggested that I look up Countess Castiglione. Countess Castiglione is a very interesting figure. She was an Italian noblewoman who became the mistress of Napoleon III in France. So apparently she was very brilliant and smart woman. And so she was used as a kind of diplomat and spy by Napoleon, and she is even supposed to have prevented a war. And what's the interesting thing about French history is that France cannot have a queen, but there have been very, very powerful mistresses, king's mistresses. And she was obviously one of them for some time at least. But another thing that she did was she loved to masquerade, and she loved to go for these parties in which there were elaborate masquerades. But she also went to this, the studio of the early French photographer Pearson, and she took many photographs over there. In fact, I think MoMA has a big collection of her work, and there was a recent tour of her exhibition. So in this particular photograph, which I found the most interesting, she's doing something that I love to do in my work, that is show the backstage. So this thing behind her head is actually a stand, which is they used to use to clamp the sitters, the head in place, because in the 19th century, they, as I said before, they used to take a long time to photograph. And the mask-like thing that she's holding in her hand is actually, after much research, I found out that it was a photo frame. So this is a lovely photograph of a woman in, of a person in the very early days of photography, actually playing with the whole idea of being a model and the photographic studio and so on. So the arrival of Vasco da Gama is one of the most complicated works I've done, because it had 13 characters, and it was based on this, it was a recreation of this 1898 oil painting by Jose Veloso Salgado, and I did it for the Kochi Muziris Biennale of 2014. So why did I choose this particular photograph? The theme of the Biennale was actually about globalization, and in fact, the arrival of Vasco da Gama in India is a kind of crucial moment in world history, because on the one hand, it opened up the trade and led to the prosperity and dominance of Europe. And on the other hand, it opened up the possibility of colonization. So what happens in this, obviously, there are several works around this arrival, this moment. In fact, there is a very famous sort of epic poem written about Vasco da Gama's voyage to India as well, and which many of the artists tried to illustrate in paintings and prints and so on, but nobody knew what had actually happened over there. So this is a kind of history painting because Jose Salgado was trained in Paris, but it's completely ahistorical because later accounts found that the reception of Vasco da Gama was not at all so grand. He was in fact the Zamorin, or the king of Calicut, refused to meet him. And when he was given an audience, he was insulted because and humiliated because he had not taken the enough. The gifts he had taken were not expensive, and so on and so forth. But in this photograph, it's a typical Orientalist scene where there's this kind of this very rich king is shown in this kind of hurly-burly kind of way with his courtiers sort of sitting around in this very untidy way, and so on. So, and the costumes are completely wrong, the postures are very strange and so on. So it is quite amusing. And this was, as I said, a very elaborate shoot. And it was a huge set. It was a 21-foot set, so I couldn't shoot in my studio. So I had to hire a film studio to shoot. And so this is a picture of my photographer, and we're just setting up. And the shoot, I think the makeup and the costumes of the 13 people, including myself, took the whole day. So we could only start actual shoot at night. So this is the picture of the whole set. And the set itself is funny because I think Salgado has just hired some, things from the furniture from some theater company or something like that, and possibly even the costumes. And what is very interesting, this whole connection between photography and painting, I think David Hockney has actually written a book about how after the invention of the pinhole camera, how Western painting changed and became realistic, because they started using the camera to draw, and that's when chiaroscuro actually entered Western European painting. And in fact, artists like Caravaggio and the Dutch painters were particularly using the pinhole camera. So I feel, I mean, that is an earlier history, but a lot of artists have used the camera even in the 19th century. And I suspect that possibly even Salgado might have taken a photograph of, because it's quite late in the 19th century, taken a photograph of this group of people and then used it as a kind of base for his drawing. And I know that recently, in fact, it's been discovered in India that the painter I was talking about, Raja Ravi Varma, who was a very popular painter in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and is supposed to have, in fact, laid the template for both mythological figures as well as the ideal Indian woman. Also used to set up a tableau in his studio and shoot the tableau and use it as a kind of base to paint. So there are some photographs of where there is a painted backdrop, and his models, one or two models, are posing in front of it exactly in the same pose as would appear in his paintings. And but it was also hidden, like it was a secret, because it was not something that was known at the time. So this is the final work, where I am playing a male figure for the first time. And here again, like I started it is actually a part of an installation, and in the installation I sort of make more elaborate, what I was doing earlier from the very beginning. In fact, I've been installing the backstage along with the photographic works, even from the Phantom Lady time, that my first work. And each time I sort of push it further so that more elements are added. So I created this kind of room where you enter through this kind of arched door into a passage. It's the walls are painted red, like many museum walls, like the Louvre or something like that. And when you first enter, you find these photographs of the makeup, that is myself being made up, and also photographs of the sets. So already you're entering something in which, and then you enter this larger room in which the photograph is there, and also the sets are displayed, elements, and then there is a desk and a blackboard with some text on it. So this desk actually, I'd kept a lot of material to read, which people have taken away on the desk. And the drawers contain spices. So one thing I didn't realize, that when I put cinnamon and other spices in there, that the whole, because Vasco da Gama's journey was based on the spice trade. So when I put the spices in there, that the smell, the aroma would fill the whole room. And here this further kind of deconstructs the image of this grand or grandiose arrival. And it has some text about the mathematical history and navigational history of India, of Kerala, the coast of Cochin and Calicut, when Vasco da Gama came. And there is a whole theory that the thing is, Vasco da Gama the Europeans at that time did not know how to cross the open sea, because they did not have the knowledge of trigonometry and so on, and calculus. And he is supposed to have used an Indian navigator to cross the sea. And apparently after Vasco da Gama's arrival, there were, of course, the Portuguese came in many batches. And Jesuit scholars are supposed to have translated several works of mathematics and taken it, and navigation, and taken it back to Portugal, which in fact the Europeans started using since then. Anyway, it was all very controversial during the time, the show. Yeah. So I want to talk to you about the shoots themselves. What happens is that I plan everything, and then sometimes things go wrong during the shoot, and sometimes I have to reshoot. And sometimes we are so careful about or bothered about the technical aspects, the lighting, the posing, and so on, that something is missing. And what happened with this photograph is that this is again by Raja Ravi Varma. And this particular scene is from the Indian epic Mahabharata. It is about this prince who is trying to molest the heroine Draupadi. And what is interesting is that this image was used as a nationalist image, because during the nationalist movement, rape was used as a metaphor for colonization. So whenever the British censors got after any kind of play or any work and banned it for being too nationalistic, people would take scenes from the epics, and they would be used as metaphors, as nationalist metaphors. So this is part of a long project I've been doing on Mother India, or the idea of the nation. And so what happened in the first one on the left is that I love the lighting on this figure, but it doesn't make any sense because our eyes don't meet. So there's no psychological tension in the image. And therefore, I had another shoot. And here, several things were changed. Of course, I used a carpet. And the eyes are meeting. And there's a sense of threat because of that. And you can see that the objects on the floor are also quite different from the objects in the earlier shoot, which actually are too well placed and stable, while obviously she has come in, Draupadi has come in carrying this plate of fruits, and she has been surprised by this man probably springing on her and dropped them and gone behind the curtain to, save herself. So this is my most recent photograph. This was at end of 2018. After that, I got busy with curating the Chennai photo Biennale. Actually, I was also working on these works and working in Chennai, and showed these works in 2019. So this is also part of my Mother India project, and it's after a contemporary work by my friend, artist Atul Doria. So this is the original painting. It's a huge painting, watercolor actually. And you find this kind of hag. Chakki is a grinding stone. So she's grinding some sort of grain sitting on the map. And so I love this work. He's done a series like this. But I couldn't figure out, I asked him whether I could recreate it, and he was quite happy. But I was thinking for many years about how exactly I could recreate this, because it's not realistic. And finally, in 2018, I figured out how to do it. So usually what I do is, this is the backdrop. What I do is I just pose in front of the backdrop and create a scene around it. But in this, I could not. The figure is in the center of the scene. So I realized that I had to do it digitally by posing separately and cutting out my figure and pasting it on the photograph of the backdrop. I normally don't do cutting and pasting in my work, even though the later ones are digital. They are really used for sort of contrast and light and so on, and I don't fiddle around with them too much. But in this particular work, it was really elaborately worked on. So this is the first shoot. Again, I was not happy with it. There are several things wrong with it. For example, the sitting posture is not okay, because it's not possible to sit in the same posture as in the painting, because the knee cannot be placed on the floor. And then the other thing which I didn't like was there's a kind of hump at the back, and I couldn't get the hump. I'm wearing an elaborate papier-mâché mask. So I decided to reshoot. And also, with the first shoot, I was a little shy. So I didn't want to expose myself too much. So I wore sort of tights and a kind of sleeveless t-shirt on top. And we painted on top of the tights, not directly on my legs. And what happened was, this is a very large image. It's 6 feet high. I found that you could see the texture of the cloth and the wrinkles on the cloth, which my printer said, look, one cannot, use Photoshop more than a point, because it gets, the image degenerates. So I decided to reshoot. So this is it was very elaborate body painting, about 10 hours of body painting. So I think the painting was going on till 10 in the night, and then we shot. So this is my assistant. She comes to assist me during the shoot. So she's painting my body with poster paint. And my other assistant who'd come to help was, he has experience in theater. So he had actually made the mask. And then he's also helping. Finally, both of them were painting my body, which was very funny. So again, with the mask on the left side was the mask used for the first shoot. And on the right is we reworked the mask for the second shoot. So you have this, in the first time, a cloth was hung from the papier-mâché face, but that didn't create the hump. So the second time we used something called EVA foam, apparently. It's a kind of flexible foam which is used in theater to make armor and so on. And it sort of stays in place. So that's what's been used and then painted over. So this is the final work, which I think I'm much more sort of happy with, where you see the posture of the leg. And again, for this, to get this posture, I had to shoot twice. We first shot with, had a shoot of just the leg. And then we shot with the whole body, and the leg was cut out and pasted on to the body later on.
Thank you so much, Pushpamala, for that really interesting and informative talk. I was thrilled to be able to be tasked with speaking with you today, and I think we have about 20 minutes before we hand it over to the audience for questions. And so I wanted to start broad and then go in a little bit more narrow as time permits. I firstly wanted to ask you about what you described in your introduction as being referred to as an artist iconoclast, or the artist iconoclast in many ways. So much of your work is about embodiment, and in many ways that's a really interesting choice for iconoclasm. It's almost counterintuitive to the idea of iconoclasm. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how specifically or broadly you see your work to be iconoclastic. What are the, apart from the kind of photographic techniques and histories you're critiquing, the broader histories maybe that you're critiquing as well?
Yeah, so a lot of what I do, the figures I use are either stereotypes or archetypes, and they're also types, which is why I was very interested in ethnographic work, because it's actually to do with types and creating types. And what I didn't actually mention, I forgot to mention, was that in the 19th century, there was also this kind of long project called Peoples of India, which was trying to document every community, every kind of, in every region and every trade all over the country, like a kind of encyclopedia. So these are the kinds of I refer to, but also it's my work is very feminist. So it's also to do with a lot of, most of my work is to do with women's images and taking apart women's images and women's narratives. So whether it's the photo romances, which are sort of strange narratives, they're not actually logical narratives, they take these kind of found, I use a lot of this found imagery in a sense and rework it and sort of put it apart so that there's a kind of strangeness to it. And even, I think even when I sort of almost perfectly copy or recreate something, an image, by putting myself in there, and I look quite different usually from those earlier, from the original figures, because I'm much larger and bigger and very modern looking as well. Like, I don't think I have that kind of traditional or like, that kind of, the look of the original characters who could be even a historical kind of character. So these are the different ways, and then also by referring to using humor. A lot of the work has a lot of humor and wit and irony and and so on. So and plus I use like art historical references, things from personal memories and things from popular culture. But it's all like I call it cultural memory. And so it's all like the cultural memory of a society, and it's very recognizable. So, but it always has a twist to it, So by icon, I don't necessarily mean the big icons, but also the familiar images one sees everywhere. So by sort of playing those images, I'm forefronting them and also making you think about them. But I can't control the thinking. Sometimes it goes off in different ways. So the audience reaction is very interesting in my work, you know.
So I think a little bit related to that and what you were saying about how you are, your position as a feminist and your critique through that. I was thinking specifically about your Mother India project. And as you were noting, there's so much about the way during Indian independence that India as a nation was configured as female and specifically Hindu, that you're sort of engaging with. And then simultaneously in recent decades, there is an increasing tendency to also, for these kinds of figures, Hindu goddesses, to be sort of co-opted by right-wing strains of India. And so I'm wondering if that kind of history is also in your mind when you are engaging with this independence era nationalist history, or in what ways you see your work engaging with that?
Very much so. Actually, my Mother India project is a very large one because I've done live performances. In fact, just recently I did a live performance in cooking one in memory of to commemorate my friend who was assassinated for her dissent a few years ago. She was a close friend of mine, a journalist and editor. So I use that figure. You know, I've been asked about using these also from the very beginning, they were sort of Hindu figures. So that they have been controversial from the beginning. But certain of these figures have also become like cliches, you know. So a lot of things I do is with cliches. So it's like a marker. Immediately people know what it is, you know. So I sort of use it like a cliche and I do different kinds of things. I think about it very carefully. I think about the politics of each image and whatever I'm using very, very carefully. It's not something that's just done, though it looks very funny, might look very funny and entertaining, but it's not done very lightly at all. I think about it, and so I'm able to, I'm also, so that I would be also able to answer the critiques, you know, of it.
I also wanted to touch a little bit on the idea of humor, which you've already raised. There's so much about your work, the very mechanisms of representation, from the photographic studio to the tableau vivant, and even some of the installation views of your work, which seems to be playing with the idea of the ethnographic exhibition, because you don't just display your photographs, but you also display sort of the objects that went into the scene and that went into composing that photograph. So much about it is, engaging with this history of photography in really interesting ways. And it's also, as you note, there's a visual wittiness to your work as a result of that. And I have always personally read that kind of humor as a kind of deeply, as a form of critique, as a way to really engage with the ideological structures that brought that original image into existence and critique it. And then I got to thinking, after reading more in preparation for this, I was reading a commentary on your work by Ajay Sinha, who I think is actually on this in attendance here today. And he got me thinking a little bit more about your work differently. And I just wanted to quote something that he says about your work in an exchange with Partha Mitter about decentering modernism. And this is what he says, I quote, "I resist reading Pushpamala's doubling of colonial photography as either a critique of the colonial text or a modernist gesture toward a pristine self. Pushpamala's doubling in Toda is a mode of attachment, not detachment, expressing a desire to grab hold of the visual trace of a historical past through a detailed corporeal process." And then he goes on to refer to your work as a form of enchanted literalism and the way that it engages with mimesis and embodiment, and not necessarily through critique. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that sort of take of your work, and what role you see critique and criticism to be of the histories you're engaging with to be central to it or kind of peripheral.
Yeah, I think there's a double thing going on in my work all the time, you know, because on the one hand, I'm sort of critiquing those images, but on the other hand, I love them as well. And the thing about the installation is I'm thinking also about the cinema and theater museums, you know, which I love. Because what happens is that you see this, I mean, there's this kind of fantastical thing, you know, scene of the theater or of a film that you've seen. And then you go into this museum and you see all these tacky sets and all those things that they've, costumes and things, notes and whatnot that they've, objects that they've used to actually make that, to create that thing. But instead of sort of, you fall in love with it even more, you know, because it becomes enchanting, it becomes magical. And so I always want to have this kind of different things happening in my work, you know. On the one hand, you know, all these things that I know I'm critical of, I also like love them, you know, I'm attracted to them. And so there's this kind of the magic of, you know, there's a magic happening, as well as there's this simultaneously, there's this kind of other kind of thing, you know, different kinds of discourses happening. But I think what I'm bringing them up to discourse, basically, because people are not really, on the one hand, they're familiar, like to whom, like, you know, and even when you put together these images and all that, nobody knows them. You know, so what happens is that you bring up these things, and even if it's a very common thing, you suddenly put it in another context, and you make this elaborate sort of setup, and you know, this tableau, and you're in it and so on, and you exhibit it. You're bringing this up to the forefront, from it's somewhere lying in the shallows somewhere, like, you know, in the depths of something, and then you bring it up to the front, to the you know, to be seen, and for to be sort of talked about, or to be thought about. So I think I'm trying to do these different things. And about this whole tableau thing, you know, about the fakery of it, I told you I saw this show in Australia of the Aboriginal photographs. And so there was this whole sort of, you know, in Australia at that time, it was very strong, the kind of Aboriginal critiques, you know, and then there's all these histories had been found and all that. And on the one hand, there'd be these kind of, you know, rage over how the ancestors had been treated, because what these guys used to do was they were completely fake, those anthropological photographs, because they were already like all these tribes and these whatever groups and communities and families had already been split up, and they were not living in their original places, and they would be brought to the studio and given a costume, and then this fake painted set would be put up, and they'd be given some things like axes and whatever, spears and all that to hold. And so the whole thing was fake, you know. So there's this kind of fake anthropology going on. But then later on, there was this other counter thing which said, actually, these photographs are valuable because this is the only documents we have of our ancestors. So it's like both things are happening, you know. On the one hand, there's this kind of travesty, you know, of those peoples, and on the other hand, they're the only records, you know. So like it's quite complex actually, and I think I'd like to have that complexity in my work as well, you know, where it's on the borderline, and I don't like it to be too sort of satirical, as was announced about my work. I don't think it's satire. I think it's they're much more complex than that, and they're different kinds of registers, you know. Because on the one hand, you get attracted to it because it's funny. People laugh like hell, you know, sometimes when they see my work, and also because they recognize all these friends and these characters and they're playing roles. So it's something like those Victorian tableaus, or even the tableaus we put up at home and so on. But on the other hand, there's always a serious sort of thing to it, which is very well thought out and researched. I do spend a lot of time researching. It's not just casually done at all.
Related a little bit to what you were talking about with regard to some of the source material you're working with being the only documents that exist, and you're sort of calling attention to gaps in the archive, gaps in the historical record. And that brings me a little bit to your series on Vasco da Gama, because that is one, or your photograph on Vasco da Gama, because that is one of, it seems one of the few instances in which you are engaging with not the way Europe represents India or the quote unquote other, but the way that Europe's own self-representation, which tends to have a much fuller, robust historical record associated, tied to it. And as a result, that kind of self-representation, it really shifts the way that your work looks. It's, it sort of shifts from images of you alone or with a few amount of people to a very male-dominated space, and a very sort of inflated narrative. And so I'm wondering if this kind of track is one that you're going to continue with, or was that a sort of one-off because of the site-specific nature of the Kochi Biennale? Any thoughts on that?
No, I don't have any plan. I don't really plan that much. Like what I'm doing now is, first of all, I can't do this for elaborate photographic and video work and all that now. So since last year, last 4-5 years, actually, I've started doing sculpture. So I've also been doing that on the side, small sculptures. And now I'm doing something I call the Meta project. I've just started where it will have different kinds of, because I should have photographic work, video work, plus sculptures, objects, all kinds of things in it, you know. So that's another track altogether that I also felt with the Vasco da Gama is that I've come to some kind of, where do I go from here, you know? So I'm actually taking a slightly different track now, bringing in all my different interests together in a sense, you know. In fact, even in my last show where I showed the Mother India photographs and videos, I've done several videos as well. I also showed a set of 100 sculptures, which are like fake documents. I mean, I'm constantly working with the idea of the museum, the inventory, the archive, the pseudo archive. Actually, I call my work also the pseudo archive. So they're like large sets of works, you know. So I'm sort of expanding that kind of thing in different ways. About the photograph, I have some idea for some photographs now, but no, it's very different from Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama also, like, it's sort of like the end, seems like the end to me of certain kinds of work which started in that tableau thing which started in Native women, you know, and it sort of reads its apogee or whatever it's called, like with Vasco da Gama. So now I think it's either fragmenting or going in different ways. I don't know. It's all in progress.
Okay, well, I think that I was told that you were meant to have 20 minutes Q&A with the audience. So I'm going to turn things over to now to Carrie. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much, Liza, for your very insightful and interesting questions, and Pushpamala for your wonderful presentation. We do have many exciting questions in the chat, so I'm going to begin with a very interesting one from an anonymous attendee who is asking about your experience of curating a biennale. They ask particularly about working with other artists and how you yourself as a working artist navigated that. What were the challenges you faced and what were the highlights?
Yeah. No, it was great fun actually. A lot of work, terrible amount of work. I had a sort of, I think the next 6 months I had a sort of collapse. I was exhausted. But no, it was, I think it's, I'm sorry, I think as an artist, like an artist curator is very different from a curator because I think an artist has a different relationship with another artist's work. At least I have, the way I see another artist's work, because I try to understand that artist and what that artist is trying to say, you know, as a working artist myself. And I would like to give each work the respect it deserves. See, what I did as a, I mean, as a exhibiting artist, and also I've curated earlier. It's not the first time I've curated, and organized a lot of different things. I keep organizing things because I organize talks and I organized seminars and many things. So it was an extension of it, and I've put some systems in place. So one of the things that I use is the PowerPoint. So I use the PowerPoint to organize material, which is actually, which now they're doing for the next one, you know. The Chennai Photo Biennale team was delighted with it. So now they're saying, like, you know, the new curators have come in, they said, you please use this PowerPoint, you know, because that puts all the material of each artist together, and as well as the shows. So in Chennai, what happened was that it's a very, very colonial city, and there are a lot of interesting, you know, sites that these people showed me. Of course, we didn't use all the sites that they showed me, but what we could finally get permissions for and all that, and 1 or 2 sites I absolutely insisted on because I'm an artist, like the art school, which is the first Western style art school in India and has very nice buildings. And then there is a artist colony, which is also the first artist sort of cooperative village, just outside Chennai. So it has nothing to do with photography, but because it has my own connection to it, I chose it as a site. So it's a little far off and it has a nice gallery and all that. So basically, what I felt, I mean, I'm sorry, but that's what I feel when I go to a large biennale, or festival, is that of course it has fantastic works. There are a range of really interesting works, and it's wonderful to see them. But most times, what I feel is they're not connected to each other. So what happens? You see some work next to it is some work which is totally different, and then you go to another work which is quite different, and so on. So they don't add up to make sense. So one of the things I wanted to do was have in each site building, I wanted to have a different show around a theme. And so they were all very site specific. Sometimes they actually responded to the site itself. Like for example, there's this charming old library, so I got 3 rooms over there. So I chose 3 artists who worked with books. So it was lovely. So amongst this old dusty books and all that, of course, we cleaned it up and all that, but it's this old colonial library, very charming building. 4 artists, sorry. And one had to be outside. He had these, that was like, so, and then like there was this kind of magnificent Senate hall in the university, which had this enormous, like 100-foot sort of ceiling hall, and like it was like a labyrinth actually. So in fact, I called it the labyrinth, and each show had a title named after a book. So it's like, and so like it was about, so all the works in the Senate hall were about the archive. So including an actual archive of photographic books and so on. And then, so that's how and then also specifically, like the way you traverse the shows, each work led to the other, and some spatially, size-wise, as well as, in terms of the subject sometimes. So sometimes as soon as you enter, there'd be a huge work hanging from the ceiling. And then just after that, there'd be low sort of tables with the books on them, and you could sit down, very meditative space where you could sit down and see. And then next to it would be something else, and then you go and upstairs, and there'd be some videos and some, whatever. Like so, and some of these, and I also, like, they wanted to get a designer, but I was sure that as an artist, I knew how to design the space, because I also install my work, design my installations myself. And one nice thing was, in the art school over there were these 2 big kind of the workshops. They were like industrial workshops, huge, fantastic spaces, but with no wall space. So I asked this young architect I met over there, and I don't know how I saw his work, but he does very interesting sort of work. So I asked him to design these 2 pavilions, and I had certain ideas in mind, and we worked together. He produced these really beautiful pavilions. So they're still there actually in the art school, which I said, like, there's this in Delhi and Jaipur, there's these, what are they called? These jantar mantars. They're these traditional astronomical, what are they called? These structures, they're like structures which are like astronomical structures. So they're absolutely beautiful. So I wanted something like that. So he actually, so when you saw them, so I didn't want sort of cabins, which most shows have. Like these square cabins in which you enter, and so that the way you went through the space, like we discussed what works would go in there, and the way you entered and exited, and so it was like this very beautiful kind of series of rooms with arches and spaces and all that. So every detail, and then another interesting thing was a lot of people like that show the best was there was another room which was a kind of museum in that art school, which had all come. In fact, I think it hadn't been opened for 50 years. There's nothing in there. But there was a lot of furniture. There were like these vitrines, very heavy, like sort of 100-year-old vitrines. So there were like horizontal ones, also vertical ones, where objects would have been kept. So I decided to use them to show photographs. So I had these beautiful sets of, what are they called? Albumin prints of this artist, and we kept these in these things. We had to repair those and polish those things, cases and all that. So every show was also very different. Some of them had only two artists, some of them had like 20 artists, and the spaces were very different. So that was also very important to me, the design of the show.
It sounds like so much work. But I really appreciate what you're saying about site specificity and attending to that. And I'm sure that the people in Chennai appreciated that too, the local constituents feeling like the specificity of their home was also being attended to. But one of the themes that you spoke about for the Biennale that also runs through your work is the archive.
Yeah.
And we have another question that somewhat relates to that from Yasufumi Nakamori, who says that modes of circulation of found images, whether a British ethnographic photo, a print of Varma's painting, or a French studio photograph, seem a part of the early visual culture that you are responding to in your work. And so he asked you to discuss the potentially new modes of circulation or of dissemination of your work beyond gallery and museum shows and performances.
New modes of circulation. I tried to do a new mode of circulation. People don't like it. Some years ago, I made postcards, letterpress postcards of my some of my works, and I wanted to sell them for 10 rupees each, and nobody bought them.
Oh no!
Now nobody's bought them, so I made them into visiting cards, and I sort of give them out. But they're really lovely little objects. No, I do have sort of. Ideas. See, one thing is that my images circulate a lot in journals and in books, and a lot of people put them on their book covers, for instance, and like different language publications in India, like actually use them, like sometimes for covers or like inside and so on. And it's very, and of course newspapers and things. But what's very interesting is that the way it's received, because some friends actually went to visit her apartment, and they saw my work in the security guard's cabin. My work, Lakshmi, he'd cut it out of a newspaper or something like that, and he'd framed it and put it over there, and he was worshipping it. So different kinds of things that are happening. And I have this idea, which I don't want to reveal now. Like, this Ravi Varma had, he was so popular at one point that people said, look, your oil paintings and all that are very expensive and all, but so many people want to have your works. So he started doing oleographs, and which is there like I grew up with them, in my puja room in my parents' house. There was these oleographs were framed and worshipped actually. So those are interesting ideas I've been having for a long time, of actually making mass prints of my works, perhaps. Doesn't suit everything though. I've also made postcard books, which I love the form actually.
Do you mean a book where you can like tear out the different postcards to send at different times?
Yeah. Yeah.
It seems like a very, accessible way for everyday people to be able to buy art.
Yes, everyday people are not interested in buying any art.
Oh, really? I would like to buy some art. There's another interesting question where someone has asked you to name a few artists that you can say without hesitation have been a source of inspiration to you at whatever stage of your career.
Oh, there are lots of artists actually. When I was a student, I was very influenced by Bhupen Kakkar, as a very well-known, famous painter, sort of, who actually, in fact, many of us were influenced by him because he really used the popular in his work and humor. And the other person I've been I was influenced by earlier was one of our professors called K.G. Subramaniam. So in fact, as a sculptor, like when I was working in terracotta, it was actually taking very much from his work. Both of them used humor in their work, so which is what attracted me to them. And I like a lot of different artists now, actually. I mean, sometimes some of their work and not others. I mean, Atul Dodia's work I like, for instance. Both of us work in a very similar way, strangely. You know, use similar sort of references in our work, and lots of historical references, popular art, and so on, 19th century art.
Sure.
So
We have another question about some of those earlier references. Someone has asked for you to talk more about the painted photographs that you showed us very early on. They say, what are the qualities that make them different from just color photographs? And how do you relate it to the history of photography?
Yeah, photographs were actually painted very commonly before the advent of color photography. So it's actually, in fact, even today, some people are painting them, because what happens is that sometimes some ancestor dies and there's no good photograph of that person. There's some very small thing which somebody wants to sort of blow up and frame it and put it up. Some grandfather or grandmother or something like that. So what they do is they take it to a photo studio, and there are these. Even in the 90s, no, when did I do this work? Early, I don't know whether that guy is still sitting over there, but in this Mahata photo studio in Delhi, there was one man sitting over there, and painting these ancestor photographs. And what they do is they blow it up, but they're very faint and they're not very attractive. So they want a color, image. So this guy paints over it and in a particular way, but my works actually are not so naturalistic as such. But you can paint them in different ways. That you can use acrylic paint and you can use different kinds of colors. But what I've used is I like to use what is called photo color. And that photo color is something like a dye. You have to be very, very careful in using it, because it actually stains the paper, the paper absorbs it. And if you sort of just put a drop on it, and then you'll have to throw away that photograph, because it's very difficult to sort of repair it after that. But it has a very magical, it has strange colors, and it's not naturalistic at all, and it doesn't look like any color photograph. In fact, people, when they first saw it, they said, "What is it you used?" It's like seeing, like, now they're colorizing these films. They don't look like color films. They have a different thing, but that is digitally done. But earlier they also used to paint those films, black and white films. In fact, there's a famous film, Mughal-e-Azam, in which one scene was painted, hand painted, and that hand painted, on film, on the film, it's a song sequence and a dance sequence, and it looks quite different from color photograph. So it's just a kind of strange pastel-y kind of thing,
Do I take it that you did the painting on the photographs yourself, as opposed to the later large-scale tableaux where you were hiring people to paint the backdrops, for example?
Yeah, all the backdrops are painted by other people.
Earlier, but on the early photos, you painted directly onto the photographs yourself?
Yeah. No, the first set was actually done by somebody, because it was part of a workshop and all that. So that was part of my project. And then I had other versions which I painted myself.
Okay. So it's been quite collaborative work for you from the beginning, it sounds like.
Yeah. I enjoy that, because what happens is these histories come into the work itself, For example, like, Tucker, like, I didn't know what he was like when I went there. I didn't know what kind of a photographer. I thought it was a normal studio. And then I found these wonderful, magical photographs of all these heroes and heroines. And he's so funny. Like, he had one photograph where there was this villain with a hat and all that, with a gun, running towards the camera. And there was this big conflagration, like, thing behind him. So I asked Tucker, I said, "What is this? How have you created this kind of effect at the back? Did you shoot it on location? I mean, during the shoot itself?" He said, No. I called him. I asked him to come here in the studio, and they're all studio photographs. And I asked him to pose like this. And he said he asked his assistant to lie at his feet, smoke a cigarette, and blow the smoke up. And he lit up the smoke so that it looks as if he's just set fire to a building or something and he's fleeing, or some kind of a
Amazing.
conflagration at the back, you know. So it's amazing, like these photographs. So it's wonderful. Now he's actually, he died some years ago. So it's like a wonderful thought for me to have I become a part of that history and he becomes a part of me, you know. So it's very interesting. It's also like getting my friends to act, you know, they also collaborate because they also give ideas.
Yeah.
And so but the thing is, I'm in control in the sense, I plan everything, and during the shoot we improvise a lot, and then later on, like, I edit and I change and I handle the whole thing. So, and I also like supervise everything that's going on so that it's whatever I want.
Well, what a rich career. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us today. I'm sorry to say that we're out of time, but I so appreciate your presentation and your enthusiastic and gracious responses to all of these fantastic questions. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today, and thank you again to Dr. Liza Oliver for her insightful questions and responses to Pushpamala's work. This concludes the Handmade Photography Today series, and I'm so grateful to everyone who has contributed to this over the past year. It's been a really wonderful way for us all to continue to come together, even over such great distances, which, speaking of, I believe it must surely be your bedtime in Bangalore, Pushpamala. So we'll let you go get some rest. But thank you again so much for joining us, and thank you, everyone. I wish you a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you, Carrie and Liza. We'll be in
Bye
touch.
bye.